The first bell arrived as a thin line of sound sewn through trees. It did not belong to wind or wildlife or river. It had that particular human precision the outdoors resents: clean pitch, quick decay, air biting for a fraction afterward, as if the sound had scraped it. The second bell arrived exactly 30 seconds later. The third, right on its heels by the same patience. On the fourth, the habit took hold, and the loop began to train the night. Counting became an involuntary act. Palm on the stopwatch, eyes on the darkness, breath measured as if exhaling on the even numbers could change the next strike. 30 seconds contains more time than a person wants when responsible for other people's sleep. In 30 seconds, a fire can find new air, a branch can decide which way to fall, a teenager can collect a bad idea and carry it quietly out of a shelter. Between bells, the forest swelled with everything it normally carries: leaves whispers, insects busy at algebra, the swallowed clicks of animals negotiating. But the sound reset attention each time it arrived, a small hammer telling the night that someone somewhere was keeping track. Responsibility had led me here and wouldn't let me pretend I hadn't arranged the conditions. The job for the summer was to shepherd groups of teenagers through a night away from the main camp, to let them fail and fix small things under supervision, how to lash sticks into shelter without building a sail, how to keep sparks from tasting what you sleep in, how to pack water that doesn't taste like its container, how to accept the kind of quiet that doesn't grant an audience. We called it wilderness, even though the map knew better. The loop the kids walked wound itself cleverly, doubling back, crossing its own scent, squeezing between a creek and a low hill full of ferns until the place felt remote enough for their nervous systems to believe in it. As the counselor, I believed in the safety net more than the illusion. The main camp, with its intrusive lights and reliable radios and adults with clipboards for emergencies, sat a mile and a half as the crow flies. We were not crows. The first week had played by the syllabus. The kids had built leaf huts and learned they leak at dawn, had burned their oats and called that seasoning, had rolled their socks into damp bricks and called that organization. Curiosity had been directed towards safe targets: a salamander found under a log and immortalized in memory, a knot finally behaving, the way a fire changes color when it eats different woods. Homesickness had put on its most subtle clothes, staring toward where the highway should be, asking unnecessary questions about breakfast, insisting that the ground was harder than any other ground had ever been. I had done the little weights and measures of adult presence, walking the perimeter like superstition requires, making sure every headlamp had fresh batteries, reminding someone in a calm voice that throwing a pine cone into the dark would always feel satisfying and always make someone else angry.
The bell changed the room we were sleeping in. It came from a distance that didn't map onto any path I knew. Our area had no chapel, no town with a steeple, no seasonal fairgrounds with quaint pretend. The main camp used whistles and radios, and both had the decency not to pretend to be bells. No shuttered church sat in our woods waiting to remind the living of schedules. The sound carried like something thrown across a lake on a windless day. Every 30 seconds, the night relearned that humans were nearby. It took 30 minutes to stop. The last strike hung for a hair longer, as if someone had lifted the bell an extra inch, then realized they were being watched. After, the forest stitched up the gap in its own pace, and the normal chorus reclaimed its timbre. Sleep did what sleep always does in the presence of anxiety: arrived late, thrashed, and left before morning could offer excuses. Daylight has an arrogant way of explaining things that frightened you 6 hours earlier. The next morning, I traced possibilities like a counselor is supposed to. Sound carries down valleys. Maybe there's a church beyond the ridge no one bothers to mark on maps because it meets in a living room and borrows a bell when necessary. Maybe teenagers in another group had brought a prop, though what prop rings evenly like clockwork and then decides it has done enough? Perhaps old machinery lives in the trees, the remains of a logging rig with a steel frame that sings when the temperature falls a certain way. Metal can remember shapes and reproduce them when the air tells it a particular story. The kids found their explanations and were glad to place them where explanations go: a hung pot, a chain clanking, a cowbell, because why not? They brushed their teeth more aggressively than necessary, the way people do when they've almost admitted worry. Breakfast took its usual rhythms: oats, arguments about water ratios, a tangle of spoons. The shelters got dismantled with the reluctance of small triumphs disassembled. We walked back along the loop that pretended to be an adventure, and arrived at the real net of adults in clipboards and vitamin-colored t-shirts we call community. My co-instructors shrugged at the bell story with the confidence of people who have slept in those woods for years and learned every unimportant noise. They had not heard it in the main camp. The dining hall's bell, used to announce meals, had not rung late. The cooks had been in bed, which in our small economy meant everything was fine. The maintenance folks offered possibilities too practical to be comforting: wind-clanging hardware they had promised to tighten, a gate somewhere banging a post as a fox tried to cheat the rules, a bear bell snagged in a tree on a migration path it had memorized. The radio room looked at the log of transmissions and saw nothing except committee-level banality. The next week, the bell returned as if it belonged to the syllabus, and someone had forgotten to tell me. Dinner finished under a sky married to the idea of late summer. Long light, insects making the case that they should be in charge. Humidity the exact amount needed to lace the air into fabric. Shelters built tighter this time because failure teaches better than instruction. The kids fell into sleeping bags earlier because experience had told them that bodies complaining out loud make for poor rest. The fire smoldered browner ember than flame, a polite compliance. Then 30 seconds became a unit of fear again.
Counting isn't a choice once you learn to do it. It's a treadmill installed in your head. In the glow of my watch, I watched the second hand sweep to the 12 and the bell meet it like a runner coming around the curve. Every strike turned the forest into a hallway, and the kids lay in it like anyone in a hallway at night, pretending invisible keeps you safe. No one moved toward the sound. No one called out. The 5th bell convinced the part of my mind that keeps score that I should be looking for some cause. The 20th told me that movement now would be a performance for kids who need adults to act like they know what they're doing. The 30th felt like the end of an old-fashioned alarm clock. The 31st didn't arrive. The morning after the second ringing, rationalizations lost weight. The map grew under my hands like a live animal. Bearings gained importance. I stood in the clearing with a compass and decided to let the day take the job of triangulation. Without the bell, the math had to be done at night. But night belonged to small bodies trying to sleep, and I had learned that the responsibility of supervision takes precedence over the curiosity of discovery. So I waited a week to be a scientist. The third group of the summer brought a different catalog of challenges. One boy who collected losing battles with gravity, a pair of girls who found in each other the ability to push a third into silence, a kid so homesick that every smell belonged to their kitchen and needed to be respected accordingly. The bell met us earlier, as if it had decided we were now colleagues. The stopwatch came out of habit. I took bearings where the sound felt strongest, and again where it felt marginal, drawing lines in a notebook under the headlamp's discrete cone. The lines didn't intersect plausibly. One pointed at the ridge to our north-northwest, where ferns replaced shrubs, and an old skid road cut through a cut that predated the kids' grandparents. Another pointed to the lake basin beyond the main camp, which should have been too far for sound to gather like that. Sound behaves the way water does when it wants to be clever. The forest is full of corners that replay notes like a bored kid hitting repeat. On the 4th week, we found something that referred to a story I hadn't heard, but pretended to have always known. After breakfast, we walked the loop backward because teaching your feet new stories matters. A few hundred yards down, off a side trail teenagers had invented with their curiosity and boots, stood a low rectangle of stacked stones sunk into the soil like the idea of a foundation. Not a building, too small. A boundary marker, a memory. On one of the stones, someone had carved a cross. Not deep, but committed. 2 other stones carried lines that might have been chisel marks or glacial confidence. The kids lifted their feet higher instinctively. A small liturgy performed when evidence of other people appears where you didn't expect it. I didn't add a story out loud. Adults ruin ruins when they talk too much about them. That night, the bell sounded less like a bell and more like a hand struck against a metal throat. The pitch had aged. The interval remained polite. If it were a prank, the patience impressed me. If it were a machine, the maintenance schedule impressed me. Both were wrong for our woods. The problem with a noise you can't explain isn't sleep. It's focus the morning after. Coffee becomes apology. The kids become a crowded list. Decisions that should be automatic require committees. The checklists multiply. When you lead, you do a kind of arithmetic people watching you don't see. This much risk means this much supervision. This angle of a slope means that talk about loose rock. This humidity demands that much more water carried. The bell crept into that arithmetic and started adding anxiety to sums that already barely worked. One kid began walking in his sleep on the 5th week, leaving a dent in his shelter wall so precise it looked intentional. Another started keeping rocks in her pockets as if weight could anchor thoughts. A third asked one too many questions about why wilderness has rules. None of them said the word bell. None needed to. On the 6th week, there were 2 chaperones. The other instructor had grown curious enough to volunteer for the overnight after weeks of hearing my observations and ignoring them the way people politely ignore someone else's recurring dream. He brought his own ideas and a second compass and the suspicion counselors cultivate to survive. Suspicion of easy astonishment. Suspicion of adding haunted to anything outdoors to make a better story later. He also brought the confidence of a person who had slept more recently than I had. The bell started at 10:58. He started counting, then smiled at me like a person noticing a coincidence and refusing to be charmed by it. At the 6th strike, his brows drew together in a scowl that did not belong to a prankster. At the 20th, he closed his notebook with that little slap a notebook makes when it has changed its owner's allegiances. It continued to 30 and stopped right on schedule. The look he gave the trees was not the look you give a teenager who thinks he has invented mischief. It was the look you give a boundary you didn't know existed. We didn't move toward it that night. I don't know whether that was wisdom or fatigue dressed as caution. At dawn, he pointed at a bearing he liked and said we would sweep that way under the innocent cover of a day hike. The sweep produced nothing but familiar ridges, a stand of young birch, pretending the soil was theirs, the skeleton of a deer that had died where coyotes were in service, and a light scatter of broken glass where someone decades earlier had decided the countryside is a waste bin. No bell, no mechanism.
Week 7 smiled itself into the routine, and that's always when things permit themselves to become dangerous. Familiarity hangs its jacket on the wrong chair. The kids were competent enough to feel confident and too inexperienced to be correct. Dinner happened on its own. Shelters took shape with less coaching. My co-instructor was not scheduled to join. His work that night involved photocopiers and announcements and other adult chores that buttoned the camp together invisibly. At dusk, a layer of cloud arrived to put a new ceiling low over our little clearing. The air stood still in a way that makes candle flames feel appreciated. At 11, a whisper of rain arrived and then changed its mind. The bell did not consult the weather. It began as before, this time lower, as if the instrument that made it had moved a foot closer to the ground. The first 5 strokes were identical. On the 6th, a kid moved. It happens quickly and feels like it happens slowly. Sleeping bag opening, weight on knees, feet finding shoes in the dark. A body believing walking solves mysteries better than rest. The first few yards make no noise. Pine needles are polite to sneakers. The tape measure of responsibility inside my head hit the end of its length and snapped me awake with the force of someone poking a chest. Movement now would be seen, so it had to be quiet. Headlamp light is a public announcement. Red light is humble, but still a declaration. I went without light. The kid's outline made a darker stripe against the darkness and then lost itself among stems. The bell arrived again, punctual. Counting got louder in my head because the world got narrower under trees. Feet know trails even when eyes don't claim to. My body recognized the line of compacted soil through ferns. The sound drifted left, then right, then left again, insincerely. I stopped every few paces because the thing I was chasing did not want to know I was chasing. Crickets made the noise crickets make when they're trying to convince you they've always been there. The canopy enforced its rules. Whatever Sky had to say didn't get down to me. At 12, with the bell counting us into whatever the night had decided to become, the woods tilted into a shallow dip where the ground felt wrong. A sponginess that didn't match the rest. Small mounds where leaves mounded in circles instead of sheets. A few more steps explained the feeling. A scatter of broken stone underfoot. Old blocks, smaller than foundation stones, larger than nothing, edges softened by decades of leaf fall. A few were set in a rough ring. More had tumbled outward the way abandoned work does when weather and root systems decide on new arrangements. In the middle, a depression waited that did not belong to water or animals.
The bell felt louder here and somehow further. My brain did the contradictory math and refused to report the answer. In the faintest leak of ambient camp sky glow, the depression got depth. Not a pit, those are carelessly dramatic, but a well nevertheless. A circle just wide enough for 2 people to stand shoulder to shoulder, lined with stone that time had pulled inward into slumps. If it ever had a cover, it had chosen another life. The impulse to lean over an edge is old. So is the impulse to anchor your feet before you do. My hands found the mosses I tell kids not to grab. Coolness climbed out of the well and met my face. It had the smell that caves have and empty refrigerators pretend to have, air that has not learned about people. The 6th bell of that sequence arrived as through a tube. The sound sharpened, then deepened, then climbed the stone walls of that old circle and changed back into a forced noise at the lip. The kid stood a few paces to my right, visible now as a smudge of darker dark. He swayed with the posture that belongs to people who have been caught by a simple hypnotism. The bell told his body when to lean his weight a fraction forward, when to imagine that forward motion answers questions, when to be ready for a suggestion that doesn't announce itself as a command. The thing about teenagers is that their threshold for obedience to things that feel like magic is higher and lower than adults both. Higher when audiences are present, lower when perfect quiet has convinced the nervous system that no one is watching. You learn not to say names at moments like that. Names are handles, and handles can tilt someone into movement they think they were already doing. So I stepped closer with the voice inside my head repeating the instructions I give during lifeguard drills. Don't grab, don't push, make yourself a place for weight to land instead of a hand to yank. The kid's heel met my shin and learned there was ground in an unexpected place, and his weight settled backward without rehearsal. My palm met his shoulder blade briefly, not a shove, just a suggestion that friction should resume its job. He leaned away from the idea of forward. 30 seconds takes a very long time when 31 might ask a body to finish something it didn't start. The next bell arrived curled through stone. It felt like it started below the ground and found the mouth only because time is patient. The kid's weight stayed with gravity its usual way. The sound did the job of a rope, and I did the job of a dull knife slipping rightward to cut it.
We stood at the lip of an old well in woods near a camp that teaches kids to treat wells as stories, not as engineering. The sound kept announcing itself. The pattern claimed the right to be present. The counting machine in the back of my skull threw numbers into a ledger none of my training had mentioned. Somewhere, a raccoon did the practical arithmetic of food. Above, the layer of cloud refused to testify. In the well, darkness rejected everything except the duty of being a below. People say bells invite. They also measure. They make attendance records. I had spent the summer taking attendance in the usual ways, heads on beds, names on rosters, pencils on clipboards. The bell had been taking attendance too, in a language older than camp paperwork. The kid who had sleepwalked into that circle had been letting the bell write his name on a line no one else could see. Interrupting that was not heroic, it was administrative. The kind of administration the woods require from people who decide to bring children into them. We returned to the clearing on a slower timetable. The kid's steps learned the habit of following again. The bell kept talking to the space we left behind. On the 30th ring, the well fell silent. 31 waited for me to turn back, and didn't. Morning made a circus of the mind. I knew better than to shepherd an entire group to the well to show them a place the forest had decided was an equation. Revealing such places turns them into projects. So I told my co-instructor where it lived and said he could go see it with the quietest boots he owned. He did, and returned with mud staining a pant leg at exactly the height of the stones. The report was what I had known. A circle, stones, a depth he couldn't measure with his headlamp, and zero sign of a bell. No visible bronze or iron, no wire sneaking off into brush, no mechanism, no prank, no sign that water had been higher recently, no leaves arranged to hide anything useful, no footprints where heavy things would have needed them. What he did bring back was a working hypothesis that comforted neither of us. A bell can be absent and still ring if the conditions ring something else like a bell. The well was a throat. Somewhere, air moved in the shallowest of breaths through a small crack between two worlds, and the shape of that mouth and the shape of the night made 30 seconds feel like a reasonable interval for lungs. The rest of the summer sat with that explanation like a polite guest who knows the family secret and will not name it. Groups came and went. The bell kept its schedule with small mischiefs to keep me honest. 10 seconds early 1 week, a pitch lower another, a rain night where it didn't bother because the world already sounded like itself. On the penultimate week, a new counselor whispered to me later, whispered not to keep the kids from hearing, but because the story makes people lower their volume without prompting. That long before the camp leased this property, when the logging road was still used for logs instead of teenagers, there had been a different camp, religious in the way cabins sometimes wear scripture, and that camp had organized a bell at the entrance, not a tower-sized one, just something a child could ring at mealtimes. The families who still live nearby remembered that bell speckling the days with a kind of order that comforted and irritated in turns. On the spring the old camp folded, they took everything easy to carry and left everything that wasn't. Maybe the bell had been too heavy. Maybe someone took it and left the habit behind. Habits are heavier than metal.
The last week arrived and did what last weeks do, replaced patience with nostalgia and good practice with thinking about laundry. I took a group whose names I felt protective of outside of forms. These kids had finally learned to coil rope instead of making knots that migrate into nightmares. They had learned to settle a camp without imposing on the trees. They had not learned to be quiet, which is normal, and not learned to accept that adults are sometimes right, which is also normal. They did not deserve bells. They deserved the very particular silence that comes from pebbles finding each other in a bottle and deciding to be content. The day folded into night with a precision that looked like the bell had gone ahead and prepared it. We were fed, watered, taught, and done with talking. I did the perimeter again, because ritual participates in reality, whether you believe it or not. After, I sat on a rock at the edge of the clearing and watched moonlight get caught on the tops of grasses the way static catches on laundry. The watch blinked what it always blinks. 10:58 arrived. 11 arrived. 11:01 arrived. The bell did not. The forest stayed with its own choir. My nervous system kept waiting, even as my rational brain pulled out a chair and asked it to sit down. At 11:10, my body made the calculus that does not require numbers. If nothing is going to ring, sleep wins. I laid down on top of my bag to borrow some of the earth's stubbornness. At 11:13, the bell began with such clarity the hairs on my arms stood up as if the sound had toggled a small switch just for them. 30 seconds later, it repeated and then continued, now more familiar than my own breath. This time it didn't stop at 30. By the 50th, the mathematics of habit had eaten any desire to calm myself with explanations. By the 80th, I knew something had changed in a way I would be required to answer. By the 100th, the kids had awakened in the same quiet way people do when they don't want to admit the thing that woke them did. One by one, heads turned in sleeping bags without announcements. The bell would not stop until someone had taken attendance and reported back. I found the notebook because notebooks are what adults carry when the world insists on asking them not to. The entries I had made all summer had become a kind of accounting. Date, time, number of strikes, oddities noted with the care of a person who understands. Paper marks are cheaper than regrets. I added a new page and wrote the one line I would need to read years later to know exactly how this felt. It is counting past our patience. On 120, I stood. On 150, I walked. On 180, I arrived at the dip in the ground without remembering the intervening steps. The well had become itself more. I do not know how else to say that. Edges that looked like rocks now looked like lips. Moss that glowed normally under moon had learned how to hoard light. The air from within felt cooler, not like a refrigerator, but like a chest that has understood its duty too well for too long. The sound rising from it no longer had the artificial crisp of a struck bell. It had the throatiness of a living instrument that does not require hardware.
Attendance is a ritual, not a bureaucracy. I took it. I counted the kids quietly by shadow and outline. Every shadow had a name. Names remain behind eyes even when mouths don't use them. Each name put a stone on one side of a balance. When the balance finally admitted it was satisfied, I stood beside the well and used the quietest version of remembering available. I remembered every kid that summer who had walked toward this circle. I remembered the chaperone who had scowled and then accepted. I remembered the maintenance guy who had considered installing boards and then had the wisdom not to improve what the forest manages. I remembered the church roomer and the old camp and the ring for meals that makes people divide their day into palatable thirds. I remembered the first night with the first group counting to 30 with their breaths and learning they could do that hard thing. I remembered the job description that doesn't mention wells. And then I marked something with a small object because the world prefers acts to thoughts. From my pocket I took the whistle I had never used in the woods, because whistles travel and noise attracts, and camps prefer to let business stay small. It was cheap, the kind you issue to counselors so they can tell each other they have equipment. I placed it at the lip of the well in a little notch where moss had decided to yield to stone. It wasn't an offering the way movies propose exchanges. It was more like a ledger entry, the kind where a bookkeeper draws a single line through a column and writes the total with the unembarrassed clarity of someone who has checked their sum twice. On the next interval, the bell's pitch changed. It went higher, then lower, then returned to the sound that had trained our nerves all summer. 20 strokes later, it stopped. The last partials hung in the air, the way the road hangs in the ear after you pull off at a rest area and finally cut the engine. Crickets stepped into the space as if hired. Owls remembered to call. A pine cone somewhere relieved itself of height and reported the fact. I waited for another, the way anyone waits after silence when silence could be a prelude. It didn't come. Instead, a pocket of quieter quiet formed just above the well, the way rooms get when everyone inside agrees to forgive each other without talking. I retrieved the whistle because it had a job to do inside my bag, not inside a hole. It felt colder than anything else I had touched that night. The kids slept, or pretended to, or kept watch, which is the older cousin of sleep and any group that is learning how to be together without deciding who is in charge. Dawn arrived on the predictable schedule sun keeps when it wants to remind people that they are lucky to exist at all. I dismantled my little control center, notes, compass, flashlight, the sense of being someone on whom decisions hang, and did breakfast like counselors do when they want the living to assert their prerogatives over whatever the night thought it was doing. Oats always win. They are boring and good, and the body recognizes them as proof that systems function without bells.
We never heard it again that summer. We stayed polite to the place that had taught us counting. We told fewer ghost stories around the embers and more stories about small techniques that prevent the later need for big heroics. We broke down shelters cleaner. We walked the loop with more sincerity. I folded my notebook in half and put it somewhere that later lives, where I keep maps of places that made my job larger than I advertised. Years later,
the maintenance team dug a shallow trench along that trail for a new line that would carry water for a small project that would keep kitchens from being burdened by hoses. They found old iron 2 feet down, curved in a way metal doesn't prefer to be unless asked. Not a bell, the cage that holds a bell. The thing a craftsman builds to let air move around a tone and persuade it to last. The ring had rusted into complacency. No human hand could have put noise in it. They put it beside the maintenance shed like the museum's camps make when they outgrow their wildest selves. Kids spooked themselves with it in daylight and then ate dinner and forgot. When I passed the place, I put a hand on the air the way you put a hand on a banister, even when you're not going up or down. You develop small rituals in any life that qualified you to keep other people safe. One of mine is counting to 30 while not moving. There is a kind of gratitude in that number now. Bells do what they were made to do, and then they do what people need them to do. Some summers are bells. Some counselors are wells. Some kids learn the sound of someone who'd rather they sleep than be counted. The forest learned to keep time for us for a while. We learned how to mark time for each other better after. Every April, before the camp opens, I still walk the loop. The map hasn't changed. The path still squeezes between the creek and the hill and pretends to be wilder than the county will allow. There is always a moment around the old foundation stones when the air builds a room around itself. If there's wind, it falls silent there. If there are birds, they jury their voices. 30 seconds still feels like a unit that belongs to somebody else, and also to me. I leave no offerings. I own a watch I don't need because the trees tell you what time it is, even when you're refusing to listen. I do the math silently and feel for the old counting machine in the back of my head. It still works. It just counts different things.